Zachary Karabell, you have written this fascinating book all about how we live in a world defined by economic indicators and how just a handful of them, GDP, inflation, unemployment, have come to define us as a nation, even though, as you make of the very good case, they are somewhat flawed and they are of limited value to a certain degree. How did we get to this point? I mean, start in the beginning. At the beginning of your book, you go all the way back to 1066 and William the Conqueror, and apparently our fascination with trying to measure where we stand in the world is very old.
Yeah, I mean, so let me start for one moment why I wrote a book about numbers, right? Which I'm not a statistician, I'm not even a trained academic economist. I mean, I kind of have played one in my professional career, but so I was interested in this question of how do we get to live in a world where these numbers are so woven into our identity and they're so woven into our conversation about how we're doing as a nation, any nation, not just we as Americans. And that I was in fact trained as an historian, so the question of was this always the case? And no, it wasn't always the case, and it was in fact only the case really, really recently, given how central they were. So the question was, when did people start to want to try to figure out what was going on economically with numbers? And I do start the book with 1066 and William the Conqueror because the first major effort in the modern world, I don't know if 1066 is modern, it is if you're a classicist, was the Domesday Book that William the Conqueror commissions to survey the output of his realm. Now, you probably could have gone back to the Romans because any empire from time immemorial basically wants to know how much land is under their control, how many troops they can command, and how much farming output, because the only real source of tax revenue is agriculture. So the Domesday Book really is just an effort to count who's farming what, with the glaring exception of not including the church, because the church wasn't under the authority of the king.
And this actually previews a big theme of your book, is that even the Domesday Book had its flaws.
Right. I mean, you would think it would be pretty simple to go around your realm and write down, how much corn or whatever crop was being grown. But even then, what it kind of shows is there's a big difference between counting and statistics. And there have been a lot of really good books about statistics. Statistics is the art of sampling a lot of stuff you count without having to count it all individually. But they didn't know that in 1066. They just tried to go around and count everything.
Well, you bring up a really good, and that's what I wanted you to talk about, the birth of statistics, because it is very different from counting.
Right.
And you point out there's another big leap forward in terms of attempting to count stuff when we get to the age of empires and trade, and sort of suddenly now you have global industry, and people are even more interested in who's making what goods and where they're headed to. But there does reach this point, and tell us when that is, when people realize the difference between counting and statistics, what statistics do for you.
Right, so sometime in the sort of the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th century, people realized that one, most aspects of human reality are just too difficult to count. And the other thing is that if you go around and you count, the first thing people realize if you try to count average lifespan, right? And particularly in a time when a lot of people didn't make it past 5, 6, 7 years old. So if you were to count all infant mortality when trying to answer the question of average lifespan, your average lifespan would be, unfortunately, extraordinarily low. So that was one of the first efforts to go, look, to really get a snapshot in numbers of what's going on, you have to actually make choices about what to leave out and how to weight things. And then there's a whole series of mathematical formulas about how to really do that artfully, which develop in the 17th century in the same soup that creates the calculus and the same German and French world of creating statistics.
Who do we credit for this?
I mean, there's Les Pierres, there's a whole number of people that if you're a statistician, you kind of remember as the great minds, in the way that we look at Newton in terms of calculus and gravity, or Leibniz. But there isn't really one person who invents this. This is just a rolling series of mathematical evolutions. And it really takes until the 19th century before you start getting kind of the economic statistics that we think of now.
Now, this book is obviously hugely focused on the United States, and you make the case that, again, this question of counting was ever present even at the very beginning of the United States, and very much on the mind of the founders, and in fact makes its way into the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think most people don't remember, because it's not the most dramatic aspect of the Constitution. I mean, we talk about slavery, we talk about North-South and the balance of small states, weak states, minority rights, the whole Federalist Papers. We don't usually talk about that the census is embedded in the Constitution that every 10 years there be a count of the population. And this is because if you're going to have representational democracy, you have to know how many people you're representing, and you have to decide how many representatives in the House of Representatives, which is the one part of the government that is directly keyed to population, is going to represent. But it quickly moves in the 19th century from just how many people are there and where to, the human curiosity to map and to measure. What are these people doing? What's their employment? How many hours do they spend working? What's the nature of their home life in terms of output? And so you kind of begin this creeping growth of information about people's lives economically, even though it starts with just funding who's living where and how many.
And so that gets us up to the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, where we begin to see the arrival of these modern indicators that now have come to define us so much. I think most people would be absolutely astounded. I mean, most people would be astounded by most things in this book because the history of this is all really interesting. But I think people will be really surprised to find out that the birth of a lot of these economic indicators was driven in a huge part by the kind of worries and political controversy, the cause of social justice that came along with the Industrial Revolution. Labor unions, people worrying about how much people worked and how hard they worked and how much were they keeping. And you have the great story of Ethelbert Stewart. Tell us a little bit about him.
So, if you'd asked many people in the 19th century about something called unemployment, it would have been a meaningless question, because when you had a purely agrarian world where everybody needed to work to live, literally, the idea that you could be unemployed or without work was kind of inconceivable, particularly because until the populations explodes in the late 19th century, there's almost always more things that need doing than there are bodies capable of doing it. So if you're not working, it's either because you're drunk or you have ill moral character or you're impaired somehow.
And you didn't really have a job, right?
You had work that needed doing to be fed. So it took the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the transfer of workforces from the farms into factories to create this thing called a job. I mean, look, we're painting with broad strokes here. I'm sure someone could find exceptions to these rules. And one of the things that drives the question of, like, what's the nature of work, right? Do people have a job? Are they getting paid for that job adequately relative to their needs? Is the series of progressive reforms in the late 19th century that saw this kind of industrial revolution as also a really chaotic and dislocating one in the United States. And one of the people who is drawn to basically the cause of social justice a la the late 19th century is this guy named Ethelbert Stewart, who was trained as a coffin maker in Illinois and ends up being appointed to the Illinois Commission of Labor, and then makes his way to Washington, where he joins what was then the very sleepy, not really well-funded, and only recently created Bureau of Labor Statistics. And Ethelbert Stewart, to picture him, I think of him as a little bit as if a statistician met Mark Twain. Ornery, suffered fools not at all, and was a kind of, I'm going to call a spade and find the numbers to measure it kind of guy. And he was one of these sort of driving forces of, we need a snapshot of employment, the nature of employment patterns, to prevent big business from taking it out of the unions.
But he's also a man in the right time as well, too, because you have this confluence of other factors. In particular, 1920, 1921, we have this recession. Yep. It sort of knocks people for a loop. You've got politicians saying, how can we even measure how bad it is when we don't know where we started from? And then, of course, you have the Great Depression. And this seems to push very much this desire to count and understand just what we're losing or how bad it is.
Yeah, so a few things in this. People like Ethelbert Stewart had been around in the late 19th century, and people like Irving Fisher, who was a Yale professor who was really interested in indices and sort of thinking about prices and what we now call inflation. So there had been some work done before the Great Depression on what's going on in this thing we now call the economy. And that too, by the way, nobody used the word the economy until the early 20th century. And the only reason why I can say that with any confidence is if you use something called Google's Ngram, which is everything printed, digitized in a Google database, and you can play around with it and find the frequency which things were used. If you type in the words the economy into Google's Ngram, until about 1930, it flatlines. There's almost no mention of it. And then about 1930, it does this hockey stick, and where it just keeps accelerating since then. Because until we create numbers, like the unemployment rate, like GDP, like inflation, there is no the economy. There's political economy, there's the output of states, but there's nothing called the economy because there's no means to measure it and capture it. And it took the Great Depression and this massive dislocation, and we didn't know it was the Great Depression in 1929. All that people knew and all that Hoover knew was some bad things were happening that actually seemed somewhat worse than earlier bad things had been happening, because there had always been bad cycles. And Hoover had been an apostle of scientific management. That was his sort of calling card to become president, was that he was a more than competent administrator during the war. He was a minor executive, and he believed in scientific management of everything. And science demands facts. Facts, in the case of an economy, demands numbers. 1929, there were none. So he agrees with some of the movements that have been in place already to fund the Bureau of Labor Statistics to actually create an unemployment number. And that is the first time in American history, or any other country's history for that matter, where this notion of an unemployment number becomes central to our body politic.
Well, now we step, though, into the vast complexity of this.
Right.
So, coming up with an unemployment number involves making lots and lots and lots of judgments.
Right.
And so these first characters who you have in your book, they actually had to sit down and say, we are going to count this and we're not going to count this, and this is our definition. Talk about some of the array of complexities in just designing that first unemployment
So
number.
first thing, what does it mean to be unemployed? What does it mean to have a job? Does it mean you're working X number of hours a week? What number of hours a week does it mean you're working? I mean, in a time when in the late 19th and early 20th century, people would work 70 hours a week. If you work 40, do you have a job? How many hours do you have to work to have a job? Do you trust people's self-identification? Hi, Kim, do you have a job? Are you going to tell the truth to a surveyor? Are the surveyors you're going to send around going to ask enough people in that kind of sampling way? Because you're not going to survey the entire population of a country and ask every single person, do you have a job? Do you have a job? You have to ask a subset of those people. So how do you do that? Do you do it geographically? If you do it only in urban areas, are you going to overstate how much unemployment there is in rural areas? If you do it only in rural, how do you decide? Is it by population? Is it by demographics? Is it by state? So all these questions have to be worked out. And in no way are they worked out initially, immediately.
Well, they're still not worked out today in
And
theory.
they're still not worked out today. Like what is, and the definition of what does it mean to be unemployed has changed over time, in that it's not having a job, to use a double negative. So to be unemployed statistically doesn't mean you're not working. It means you wish to have a full-time job. You have at least told the people asking you that you are looking actively for a full-time job for a period of time before you got asked that question. Now it's 4 weeks. Earlier it was 8. And that you are therefore unemployed because you're looking and can't get work. It's not that you just don't have work. And we use the term much more loosely today because we use it as a kind of thumbs up, thumb down. And even getting to the point of defining it was immensely complicated in the 1930s.
How did you do that in the end? I mean, who made the final decision?
Again, this is sort of decision-making by lots of different voices and people arguing. It's not like there was one person who says, this is the rate. And England was doing its own work at the time, although very few other countries were. I mean, a lot of these, the reason why you should focus on the United States is a lot of the creation of these numbers comes from the United States and then goes global. It's not like multiple societies were doing this simultaneously. So this desire to kind of command, know, understand what's going on economically stems, at least in our history, from an American initiative and some British initiatives, and then goes global.
So alongside the unemployment rate, we also have the creation of gross domestic product,
Right.
or the precursors of that, rather, too. And this is happening at the same time.
Exactly.
You run through this. And again, you point out that part of this was about needing to assess the depth of this recession that was going on and understanding what the output of the country was now versus what maybe it had been and how we're going to things look going forward. But you also point out, and this is when you get a whole new aspect into this mix, is that what's happening at this time is that you are also getting the concept of government as an economic actor.
Right, and this again had been somewhat alien other than in times of war. Governments have always been economic actors in times of war because they sort of force everything to focus on war production and supplying armies. And one thing you had in the 1930s was, as we know, this huge effort of government spending in the form of the New Deal in the United States. The Labour government in Great Britain was doing its own form of it. And one of the things that happens in the U.S. is the understandable desire of the Roosevelt administration, particularly to say to its critics that, yes, we've just done all this completely unprecedented stuff and spent all this money. Is it doing any good? Is it making things better? But unless you can actually measure this thing called an economy and its output, and then show its output was X, we spent a lot of money, and look, its output is Y, and Y is bigger than X, it's just an ideological argument, which is what it had been until then. So there have been people, back to the Domesday Book, of trying to measure the output of a country economically. And those have been kind of happenstance in academics. I mean, all these things have their seeds before they become...
When's like the first time you see people doing that?
I mean, that's really in the 17th century as well, the same time when statistics gets created. And then there's like a lull. Like there's some efforts, and it's usually rich men who think this would be kind of fun. You know, the same rich men who do experiments in their garages. They say, well, wouldn't it be fun to measure the output of a country? And then it kind of lays low until really the early 20th century, some efforts in the 19th. And in the U.S., there's an emigre economist, a Russian emigre named Simon Kuznets, who later wins the Nobel Prize. We obviously know about John Maynard Keynes in Britain, and people like Sir Richard Stone, who's another sort of eminence of this. And they start saying, okay, how do we measure output? And what does that even mean? Right? What does it mean to measure the output of a country? So defining that. Big definition in the 1930s was, do you include domestic work? Because one of the things women did largely was cook, clean, make sure the home was taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, if my domestic work were included, like GDP would double.
Would go up immensely. So, and Kuznets, for one, said, look, we absolutely should include this. This is a really essential aspect of economic activity that's productive, and the absence of which is destructive. The argument was made, though, unless it has a market price, we're not going to include it. So GDP, or then national accounts, are simply, what is the market output? Things that are bought and sold that has a price and a cost. And so it was decided to leave out domestic work because it was hard to figure out what the cost of that was.
Well, but this is more than just, I mean, you point out that this is about Roosevelt administration saying they wanted to be able to say, look, we put this much money in, and now this is all the benefit that came from them. It was also the idea, I mean, Keynesianism, it had a predictive value too, in that if you're a Keynesian, then you believe that, you know, you've got to stimulate demand, and in order to know how much you need to stimulate demand, you actually have to know where things stand at the moment.
And then you get this birth of things that I guess are a little bit familiar in our current discussion, particularly after 2008, 2009, of like, how much output do you need to stimulate? How much demand do you need to stimulate? What's the gap between what we're doing and what we think the optimal or the right level is? And we think about that in terms of employment, right? So if there's a 6.5% unemployment right now, if I just told you that and you were like plopped down here from Mars, there would be no reason to know whether that was a good number or a bad number. It's only perceived as a bad number, and this is not about whether or not people are finding jobs, because we have this sense of what we think this system ought to be doing numerically based on what it did do numerically. And none of that pertained in the 1930s. This is all kind of being made up as it goes along. So we create national accounts, and it allows the Roosevelt administration to start talking about national income by the late 1930s and saying, look, our national income is going up. The next real catalyst is World War II, right? Which is, the real challenge for the United States in World War II was, if we're going to be the armory of the world, how much domestic industry, cars and tractors and whatever we were making in factories, could be shifted to producing guns and planes and ammunition without so enfeebling domestic economic life that you basically win the war but your economy collapses. And in order to do that, you had to understand how much are we producing, how much can we produce, how much more can we produce without generating scarcity and therefore inflation, which had been the big bugaboo of all societies during war. And so you create GDP, which is really the tool to do this. It would take much longer to explain exactly how. Then it was GNP, now it's GDP. And that was a really potent tool. At least people believed it to be one of the most essential components in allowing the United States to calibrate the war effort with the domestic economy so that you end 1945 having won the war without having to then, revive your economic life. And that's what allowed the United States to be so powerful in 1945, because most countries, after fighting a war like that, take years to rebuild internally.
Well, you get back to this point, you were talking about the creation of the economy, how these statistics or these numbers allow the creation of the economy. And what you're also describing here, and you do it very well in the book, is this fundamental shift to that government had the ability, much in a way mirrored the Industrial Revolution, to manage the economy.
Right.
and you could actually look at these numbers and you could say, okay, now we're going to move this much here and this much here, and everything will still be okay in the end. And this is a new concept.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that the governments had done before that is to try to figure out how much more revenue can I create, right? That was the sole challenge. I mean, think of dynasties and kingdoms for time immemorial.
Fund this army,
How do I get the
tax
money?
you this much, right?
But the idea that you have this thing called economic policy where you calibrate and you try to end economic cycles, right? The ups and downs that were just part and parcel of history for one reason or another. That's all part of this sort of the scientific revolution and the emergence of centralized governments. And it is, in fact, one reason why even today there is, and I'm sure will continue to be, a deep seed of suspicion in every society that all these numbers, GDP, inflation, unemployment, aren't actual numbers that reflect experience of people. They are ways for government to exert control. I don't really go into that a lot in the book, and I think that's a whole kind of another question and subject. But it is definitely one that underlies all of this discussion. And people kind of listen to these numbers and they go, oh, come on, right? Particularly about inflation, that inflation isn't telling me how much it costs for me to live. It's just a way for government to prevent my cost of living allowances from going up or something like that.
Well, you actually touch, and I do want to talk about the conspiracy theories around these numbers because it's a fascinating aspect of it. But you touch on something basically post-World War II. You describe how we enter into this explosion of sort of fascination with these economic indicators. And you have the growth of yet new ones, and private players start to get involved, and they start making their own. And we can talk about a few of those. But one of the innovations in a sense, like a whole new area of kind of an economic indicator, and you have this guy named George Katona who starts to measure, and this gets to your point about the people, starts to measure consumer sentiment and uses that as an economic indicator.
Yeah, so kind of 1940s, 1950s, you have this efflorescence of numbers. And you'd had some before, like there had been housing associations, and there had been some purchasing managers, the people, companies who buy stuff, trying to figure out what was going on nationally. And then you get these associations that start going, well, government's creating statistics, so we're going to create statistics. And then you have academics who think, okay, well, what are we going to add to this? And there was this kind of quirky guy named George Katona, who, another emigre like Simon Kuznets to the United States, came in the 1930s, trained both as an economist and as a Gestalt psychologist. So if anybody remembers the 1970s, Gestalt psychology was like a big deal, what was the Gestalt? And without going into that warren of discussion, his belief was that how people think and feel individually shapes their behavior economically. And therefore, if you can get a gauge of how people feel, you're going to get a gauge of how they're about to act. Now, initially, that was interesting, actually, for the government during World War II, because there's always been an aspect of inflation and prices that is based only on what people perceive. If you think things are going to get cheaper, you'll hoard, you won't spend. If you think there's going to be inflation, you'll spend a lot now. I mean, there's behavior that goes with that expectation. So they wanted to kind of gauge it and make sure that inflation expectations were being kept tame. And they developed basic surveys, 5 questions. Do you feel good or bad about the economy? Do you feel good about your own personal finances? Do you think it's going to be better in 6 months or worse in 6 months? And then you took all those questions and all those surveys and you created numbers, and then you created an index and you created a number called consumer sentiment, which we now live with every month from multiple sources. There are like 3 organizations now that disseminate consumer sentiment. University of Michigan, the Conference Board, ABC News for a while had a consumer survey. And it all begins from this kind of Gestalt psychologist economist. The one thing that has only been clear since then, even though it's really interesting, like, oh, what do people feel, is that its predictive power is absolutely 0.
Yeah,
right?
Critics have been very harsh on this.
And legitimately so. Now, his pushback was, you can't test whether or not this works by asking a family 6 months later whether or not they did what they said 6 months before. It's not like about individual behavior being predictive. And that was the whole Gestalt thing. It's about patterns of if enough people say they're not feeling good, that might be a leading indicator of...
Is there evidence that
There's
works?
not any real evidence of that either.
Right, but this nonetheless remains an aspect, an important aspect.
Because we come to be in a culture where we like numbers to sort of describe reality.
But this is the point of this chapter, is you talk about in the 40s, the 50s, on the 60s too. You don't just have this huge spiraling of numbers, but you have the media really focusing on these, and business communities really focusing on these, and they become to be interwoven in America's ideas of how we are we performing vis-a-vis everybody else.
Right.
Correct?
Yes, and part of this is there is a Henry Luce, Time Magazine, Fortune, Business Week phenomenon of you suddenly have these outlets that talk about economic life. But I think more to the point, you have to think about the nature of the Cold War and the degree to which the Cold War, because it was a Cold War, we were not fighting the Soviet Union, and it was perceived legitimately as a contest of economic systems, ideological ones, but economic ones at heart, modes of production. And so a lot of the Cold War unfolds with whose economic system is doing better, who's making more stuff, whose stuff is better, whose output is greater.
And the Soviets were big on these.
And they had their own, gross Soviet product. We had our gross national product. And there's a really famous debate between Nixon and Khrushchev when Nixon was vice president in 1958. We called the kitchen debate. I think it was 58, where they're kind of arguing about appliances. And part of it is literally whose stuff is better, who's making more of it. So you had the nuclear weapons on the one hand, and then you had industrial output at the other. And then you had all these nations in the world kind of decolonizing, becoming new countries that had been ruled by France or by Britain or by Portugal. And one of the things that you have to do when you join the UN is you have to start measuring this thing called your economy, because if you're a new nation and you want economic aid from the World Bank or from the International Monetary Fund, the criteria is you've got to be able to show that that money had a good effect. So just like the GNP was created for the New Deal, for Roosevelt to show that the spending was working, the 1950s and 1960s, if you're a new African country or a new Asian country and you want economic aid, you have to be able to show that it's improved your economic life. And so you have to start measuring GNP and GDP, and you do so according to mandates established by the UN, which are exactly the framework set by the United States. So suddenly by the late 1960s, you go from a world where no one talked about any of this. No one measured prices, no one measured output, no one measured employment, to a world where every country in the world is doing it, and they're doing it according to exactly the same blueprint.
And let's talk about that for a minute, because the UN part here is very important. UN, the World Bank, and the IMF. And as you said, there is this requirement suddenly that you do this. But what's fascinating is why, in that you describe how you're coming out of World War II. And there's this fundamental belief that one of the reasons things went so wrong is you had a country, Germany, that was having a great deal of economic distress, and this was part of the motivating thing that pushed it into war. We don't want a situation like that again. We want to know, where do economies stand in the world, because this is somehow also going to allow us to manage peace and stability.
Right, and I think people do, and have in fact, as you really well point out, forget the degree to which even the UN is formed. Half of it's about economic rights, half of it's about economic security. There's actually an Economic Security Council in the UN that I think most of us, unless you really look at it, are ignorant of. We all know about the Security Council, right? Because it was front and center in the Cold War about states and problems. But half of the work of the UN was, or more of it, was always about economic development, exactly in the belief that when there's economic insecurity, when you have things like the Great Depression, then that will then lead to things like World War II. Now that may be a completely wrong thesis. We don't get to replay the tape, but it was clearly the animating thesis, and it led to this. Just like there was a proliferation of nuclear weapons, in the Cold War there's a proliferation of economic numbers, whereby the entire world becomes kind of indicatored. We all now measure our lives with this dashboard of numbers in a way that before the 1950s absolutely no one did.
One last thing that you talked about in terms of what inspired this huge growth as well, too, is there's money in producing these things, too. But a lot of these are produced by private organizations. You mentioned George Katona in his work. He was at the University of Michigan, which I believe has made a fair amount of dollars off of producing some of these indexes.
And then businesses start paying for it, and then Wall Street starts paying for it. I mean, that's a big factor here. And that's really, again, a later one. You have to get into the 1970s and 1980s, where people start wanting a trading edge, and they start trading on the numbers in the belief that the numbers will then represent something fundamental in economic activity, which I guess would have influence over corporate earnings, right? So the numbers business becomes a huge one. The National Association of Home Builders starts putting out its set of numbers. The Institute of Supply Management starts putting out its numbers about manufacturing activity. And then the Federal Reserve starts getting into the act and starts doing regional manufacturing surveys. And again, you have this proliferation in a way that just was sort of inconceivable. And I think one thing that I try to be really clear about in the book is that just like we all individually have a point of origin, we're born at a certain time, we're shaped by that culture that we grew up in, all of these numbers are born within a few decades of each other fundamentally. And they are a product of that time. They are a product of the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, mostly. And in that respect, they were designed at that origin moment to measure that world. And they do a pretty good job measuring that world. They do a pretty good job measuring a world of industrial nation states that make stuff. But we don't live in that world anymore. And I mean, I know that we're now segueing a bit, but it's the reason to look at that history is to try to understand who invented these numbers to answer what questions at what moment in time, and is the world we are now living in the same as that world?
Well, I mean, actually, the segue is great, because let's talk a little bit about all the problems with the fact that we now have arrived in this period of time in the world where we so do define ourselves based on this indicator. So one of the things which you just mentioned, and you make a very strong case for in the book, is that these numbers are, by and large, wholly inadequate for the purposes for which they're used. And one of the descriptions I just loved is talk about the iPhone and the way we measure, for instance, the trade deficit.
Right.
And how that might have worked at one point and how it doesn't work in any way now to adequately tell us what our trade deficit is.
So, to be really clear, I do think a lot of these are inadequate. I do think, though, I kind of honor the degree to which they were not just adequate, but they were really important when they were invented. They're inadequate the way a 1950s car, which was great, you know, and your parents and your grandparents still remember the 1950 Chevy or whatever the car they had as being this wondrous car, and it was. But if I gave it to you today and said, this is your car, you know, no air conditioning, no anti-lock brakes, really bad fuel mileage, terrible pickup on the roads, you'd probably go, you know, not such a great thing. So trade numbers, which we talked about as being very old in the sense of nations tended to get revenue either from farming or from tariffs on trade. Trade numbers act as if everything that we buy and purchase is made in one place, in one country. And I think in the 1950s, when a lot of the initial rules were codified, even in the 1980s, the idea that an iPhone, that a phone, that a washing machine is made in a factory in one country, and then is either sold and bought in that country or it's sent abroad to another place as an export, made some sense. You know, there might have been parts that were different, but they were usually parts that were sourced locally. Think of Detroit. Yes, a lot of those parts came from Toledo and the steel came from Pennsylvania, but it was still an American car made of American parts. So today an iPhone, which, you know, in many ways is the quintessential American product, invented by this quirky genius in Silicon Valley, headquartered in Cupertino, California, on and off the largest company in the world. Every time an iPhone gets sold in the United States, it registers as an import from China. Why?
This is billions in our trade deficit.
6 billion, 7 billion. I mean, it's hard to know exactly, but if you add the iPad, we're probably above $10 billion a year in those devices alone, Apple devices, add to the trade deficit with China. Because they are made in factories, many of which are in Shenzhen, which is in southern China. So they get made in that factory, and they can put on a container ship, and they show up at the port of Long Beach, and they get assigned their wholesale price, which is a declared price that Apple puts on it, $200, $220. Customs Department writes that down, and it's a $200 import or $250 import from China. But is it really, right? Is anything that we now use really made in any one country? Whether it's a T-shirt where cotton comes from one country and the pattern comes from another and the swatches come and then they're assembled. It is clear that the iPhone is assembled in a factory in Shenzhen. It is not clear that $220 or $250 goes from the United States to China every time one is bought, because if you break down that iPhone, which a bunch of economists have done, and which the Asian Development Bank has done, and which the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development have done, you find that there are parts from Germany, and parts from Korea, and parts from Taiwan, and plastic from somewhere else, and parts from America, and above all, intellectual property
right,
from the U.S. But in a world of trade numbers that assume that an object has a final substantive transformation in one country, we've no way of breaking any of that down.
Well, also the fact, too, that it doesn't even sell here in this country for what it is marked down in the trade deficit.
Right.
And that, I mean, I think the retail value when they first came out was $499,
right,
but nobody ever paid that much for it because of agreements with cell phone, providers, the seven carriers, right?
But I think if you do this you can do this for every manufactured and many other goods that aren't manufactured as heavily, furniture, clothing, and you would find that the way in which value is dispersed in global supply chains, we just don't know how to capture with a set of numbers that assume that a thing is made in one place, whereas today, most things are made everywhere. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was possible because of information technologies that allowed you to design this plane on an AutoCAD computer system and then source parts from dozens of countries around the world. Now, every time it gets sold, when Boeing sells one from its factory outside of Seattle to Japan Airlines, it shows up as a U.S. export. But it's not in the way that we assume value add flows. And we are doing, I think, just a really bad job capturing it. The even worse news is I don't know how we change that. No one's going to spend billions of dollars to break down tens of or hundreds of thousands of goods into their various components. And so right now we're stuck with the figures we have, but it's creating an optic, I think, of what's going on globally that's profoundly wrong.
Well, in addition to the complexity in living in a global world of actually using these numbers and counting things the right way, you have the fact, too, that these indicators, many of them have been and continue to be mired in controversy in terms of, you talked a bit about the complexity that went into the decisions about what you count and what you're not going to count. But you also, think about it, the one that we didn't talk about, but which you devote a chapter of your book to on inflation. There is probably on a daily basis no more controversial issue than the cost of living in this country because, people believe that the government keeps it at a certain level so that they can keep down Social Security benefits that they have to pay out, or so that businesses don't have to pay their employees as much on average. And it's just this constant source of tension, which is all the more remarkable given the kind of crazy decisions that go into deciding how this is come up with and whether or not it actually is a very good indicator of anything.
Yeah, and part of it is a misunderstanding of what inflation as a government consumer price index is supposed to do. It's supposed to measure systemic price stability. It is not supposed to tell Kim and Zachary whether or not our cost of living is commensurate with our income, whether or not we're able to meet our needs or our desires or both, relative to what we expect. And so, inflation becomes this real nub of people's experience of their economic lives versus their expectations versus their ability to meet it. And human memory around prices and the movement of prices is absolutely terrible. I mean, it is clear, at least from inflation numbers, as measured by the government's consumer price index, that the amount of money you and I spend as a percentage of income on food and fuel has gone down dramatically since the 1950s. But that's not our daily experience of meeting our needs. And to be fair, I actually think inflation numbers that are kept by the government are amongst the more reliable. And some of the attempts to do different methodologies, Google started creating its own inflation index because it has all this information flowing through its servers. 2 MIT economists created the Billion Prices Project, which said, hey, instead of sending out really expensive surveys, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to create these. You can just create a computer program that takes online pricing in real time. What's interesting about those alternatives is they don't diverge a whole lot from our official inflation numbers. But the problem is, what's the question those indices answer versus what are the expectations we place on them publicly? And again, they're not meant to tell us our cost of living, but that's how we discuss them. And the other problem with inflation is baskets of goods change. We're no longer buying landlines and we have cell phones. The whole cell phone issue is a huge one with these numbers, and that so many of our government statistics are dependent on government statisticians calling you on your phone at home. So if you don't have a phone at home, if you have a cell phone, if you're 25 years old and you don't have a landline, the odds of you being reached by these surveys is de minimis because they don't want to mess up the sample set. You don't know where someone is if they've got a cell phone because you can take it with you anywhere. 25-year-olds don't tend to answer survey questions in nearly the same rate. So there's a whole other issue of exactly where are we even getting our information from.
Well, you have really fun stories in the book about how, this has been a problem since the start, about the quality of putting together some of these samples. And, going back, you had the first, I think, unemployment calls that went out, and you were talking about how a lot of these people that were hired to do this were hired by the Roosevelt government as part of the Government Works program. They weren't statisticians. They didn't necessarily know what they were doing, and apparently the product from back then is wanting.
Yeah, there were all these surveyors who, it's a really boring job to knock on doors and say, are you employed? What's your profession? So a bunch of guys got really bored, sat down in a corner, and just started filling out the sheets themselves. And even today, there are all these lingering suspicions. We had this in the 2012 election about whether or not, these are numbers that are cooked or somehow manipulated. I think that the likelihood of that is really low. But they're such complicated entities now with such vast databases going into them that, you do have to ask, what are we measuring versus what do we think we're measuring?
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, because you do have a lot in there about the controversies that have plagued this over the years. And it goes way back. George Meany, who ran the Labor, Federation for a while, was a fierce critic of some of these numbers. He believed that they were being put out specifically to kind of ding the unions and make it harder for working people. And you go all the way up to the point you just made, Jack Welch, 2012, there was an argument about whether or not the unemployment report had been juked in some way. But the question I have for you is, isn't it maybe fair for people to wonder that to some degree? Only because, your book, in fact, is all about the kind of history behind some of this. There were people that were kind of social crusaders who wanted to use these numbers to some degree to create a new social order and justice in the country, and that was at least part of the motivating idea behind these indicators.
Yeah, although I think today most of the people who are in charge of compiling them are much more in that kind of like technocratic, bureaucratic, statistician, just trying to answer the question. And if anything, because of that, are not able to deal with these larger questions of, to what degree is, even if they're perfectly done, what are they measuring versus what is the world we currently inhabit? I think the conspiracy question is almost a secondary one relative to the promise of these numbers versus what they actually deliver is the real issue, is the real disjuncture. And the hubris of policymakers utilizing these numbers, and economists in particular, as if there are absolute patterns that emerge that you can then know. I mean, one of the things I'm most sort of passionate about in this is, so we'll talk about it for a minute. When President Obama gets up in 2009 and makes his speech announcing the stimulus bill and says, with this $787 billion bill, we will create or save 3.5 million jobs. Now, I want to make this really clear. This is not a partisan critique of the stimulus plan. What fascinated me is what allows the leader of a country to get up and make with such specificity a dollar amount of spending with a job creation number that's specific. Right? That would have been inconceivable. I mean, Roosevelt, Lincoln, nobody got up and made that. You would have said, we're going to spend a lot of money because there's a problem and it's going to do good. That's a one kind of statement. But to make a formulaic number, we're going to spend X amount and create Y amount of jobs. And that comes out of a belief that we have enough information, enough data, and enough of these numbers that we know that when government spends a certain amount, this amount of jobs gets created. Right? But if these numbers were only invented in the middle of the 20th century, we don't know a lot. We don't know nearly as much as we think we know to make those kinds of statements on a routine basis. And Democrats and Republicans do this about all spending bills. We project out what we think the effects are going to be. And the Congressional Budget Office, which I'm highly critical of, not because they're doing a bad job, the entire conceit behind it of we can know with any degree of certainty the outcomes of these things.
Well, and all this is happening at a time, and you make this point as well, that when in fact the economy has become more complex.
Right.
More difficult to govern. So you have a government that on one hand has become ever more self-assured about its ability to manage this thing called the economy, even as this thing called the economy has become ever more unmanageable.
Yeah, and then not only unmanageable, but global. So the economy assumes that the nation is the same thing, right? So every economy is national. But we've been talking for 20 years now about the degree to which we live in a global economic system. And it is certainly true in everything we buy, back to the iPhone, back to the Boeing plane. We live in a global supply chain. We live in a world where money flows globally. And so the idea that a set of 1950s national numbers can adequately serve as our map in kind of a 21st century world of global international interchange, and then add in the role of technology, right? Like, how do you measure Google in GDP?
Right.
There was no information technologies of the kind we have now, most of which we use for free, so they don't have a market price. I mean, the only way some economists now are trying to figure out what's the economic output of free applications is to think of, well, we all value our time if we're working, so if you're getting paid $30 an hour or $20 an hour and you take 15 minutes to go into Google, you're essentially valuing your Google time at, a quarter of an hour of your work. And then multiply that by the amount of hours we know people spend on Google. Now, that's a way to get at it, right? But is that really the way to get at it? We don't know how to measure the output of these things.
Well, in addition to the hubris, which you mentioned, and the controversy that has always plagued these, and the kind of inadequacy in a global world of how well they can actually predict anything. You have this fun thing about the difference between leading and lagging indicator. The idea of a lagging indicator is just weird to begin with. But there's also the fact that these things have become, and maybe actually, it's justice. That the politicians that helped inspire the creation of these, leading indicators, that they're very interwoven with politics today. And you had some, going all the way back, you talked about Hoover and the fact that here he drove so hard to try to get some measure of unemployment, and it dinged him in the end because people found out unemployment was quite bad.
Right. He basically, my joke in that is he gets hoist on his own statistical petard. Like, he creates the number that then gets used against him. I mean, I do think that is part of it, although, and again, every country in the world now, think of the Chinese government, right? They've made their entire sense of legitimacy hinge on maintaining a level of GDP growth and employment creation that is statistically manifest. I mean, these numbers have become our latter-day version of land and empire. We measure our national strength based on what these numbers tell us. And so we literally invest them with this huge amount of weight. And it's impossible for them then to not enter kind of a political debate and political dialogue, even though, again, I feel like we are capturing only one aspect of the world we're living in, because it's not like there's this major global move or anyone's going to spend a lot of money to reinvestigate our statistical framework for the 21st century.
Well, I mean, and you also mentioned not just China, but Argentina. I mean, it became a bit of a global pariah because people felt it was cooking its indicators, right?
Well, I mean, they really did try to cook their indicators. I mean, in 2008, 2009, the Kirchners fired the what would have been our Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation department, because they were routinely reporting higher inflation than the Kirchners wanted to be reported, because it was undermining their claim to economic stewardship. And then, it gets kind of theater of the absurd here, and I'm sure there's an equivalent in Venezuela, and I'm sure, North Korea doesn't have a statistical agency. They have a set of numbers they write down. The group that got fired tried to set up a nonprofit group to then be the real due diligence group, and then the Argentine government stripped them of their nonprofit status to try to prevent them from being the watchdog. So we at least don't have those issues in most of the, at least. I mean, that's one saving grace.
Well, let me ask you this, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we do about all of this. But before I do, if you went back and you looked at the world prior to some of these leading indicators, are we even better off now?
I think we were better off.
We created more problems than we fixed.
I think the problem of economic policy making today is it does hinge on a belief, and this is true no matter where you are in the political spectrum, that you can capture what's going on statistically and then manipulate it effectively. And the reality is business cycles have become less intense. The worst of our up and downs today, even with 2008, 2009, are probably not nearly as severe as they were throughout the 19th century or before that. We've removed food famine on the one hand from most of the world, and even where it's a problem, it's usually a political problem, not a food problem. And we've removed the worst of economic cycles in the sense of, you don't get 30% of the workforce out of work, and you don't get people literally on the streets by the millions.
And you think this is in part because...
I think it's in part because we learned something about economic systems. But that's very different than how do you deal with changed realities, right? I think we're really good, again, at managing the economic systems of the past. My real concern is we're kind of, again, flying blind with the economic systems of the present, but we're using the only map we've got,
So you talk some in the book about movements by some to create different indicators, as it were. And you have this fabulous story about the King of Bhutan. I mean, and this seems to go back, you actually open in the beginning of the book with this speech. This is a long-running theme that Robert Kennedy gave all the way back in the 60s, saying, railing against GDP and saying, we ought to be measuring our confidence and the way we educate our children and all these other things that make up the great and good America.
Right.
And you still see that dissatisfaction with and attempts by others to come up with something better.
Yes, there was a big GDP backlash in the 70s, partly because GDP was seen as encapsulating the materialism and materialist values versus the softer values that are important to any society. Happiness. And that's where this small kingdom, landlocked Buddhist kingdom of Bhutan said, look, we ought to be measuring aggregate happiness. It's not individual happiness. And all the Westerners who have since kind of gone, oh, this would be great if we would measure happiness, kind of forget that their happiness was pretty collective, and a lot of us, I think, would be rather unhappy with their happiness. Again, the issue there is not, okay, is that a better way to measure something that GDP fails to measure? It's the idea that you could come up with one number that adequately tells you anything meaningful about the world you're living in, whether it's economic or otherwise. One number for 320 million Americans, one number for 1 million New Yorkers or 1 million people in Bhutan. What good does one number tell you? One number is always a synthetic average of something. And maybe it can tell you something about the system then, the system now, in a kind of aggregate sense. But GDP, too, it tells you really very little about most questions we have as Americans, about quality of life, about the sustainability of economic growth, about whether or not economic activity today in the present is likely to be sustained and augmented in the future, right? Because all output is neutral in GDP. If there's 2 hurricanes tomorrow, that's really good for GDP because you spend a lot of money cleaning up after a hurricane. But it's not like you would say, to fix America's economic woes, we should just have 5 hurricanes, right? But GDP would say that's a perfectly fine way of doing it. So the question is, what are our questions? I mean, I'm trying to help people, I'm trying to help myself say, we should start with the questions and then find numbers and find statistics that help us answer them. Because all of those numbers were created initially to answer a question, a really important question. It's when they get detached from the question they were meant to answer and they get kind of enshrined as this is an important number that you have real problems. And the people who created these numbers understood that that's what human beings do with statistics. They kind of enshrine them as absolute and forget what they were meant to answer in the first place.
Well, so this is your idea for the solution, rather than coming up with just an alternate, different indicator.
Right.
But rather, as you said, bespoke indicators.
Yes.
So turn this entire paradigm on its head and say, what is the question that we are trying to answer? And then look at the vast range of data out there and get that.
Yeah, and I mean, I like the bespoke idea because it means made to measure. If you're going to talk about measuring things, what are you trying to measure and why? So GDP has become GDP is supposed to grow because it's supposed to grow, because when it grows, people's income goes up and people's quality of life goes up. What we're seeing today in a lot of parts of the world is, in fact, GDP can grow quite a bit without income going up. If a robot in a factory is going to produce what 500 people in a factory used to produce, that factory's output can go up without creating any jobs. So the question that GDP is supposed to answer, is our collective affluence going up if GDP goes up, may actually not be true. What then is the question? The question is, how do we have affluence go up? Where is it doing well? Where is it doing badly? And we have more information than ever before about all these things.
States and counties
and gender and
geography
demographics and where you live. And the one real defense of these numbers today being collected is that underneath every number is vast amounts of information. Every GDP report comes with hundreds of tables. Every unemployment report, dozens and dozens. Every inflation report comes with 8 different alternative inflation gauges by geography, by consumption. That information is very useful. We don't really use that information usefully. And when you get down to the business and individual level, then you have to start going, these numbers do what? Right? What is, if I told you GDP is going up 2% or down 2%, and the National Association of Mortgage said that there was X number of mortgages and house rates were Y, would you decide to then buy a house or not buy a house on the basis of them? I mean, I would hope not. And again, I fear that many people are.
Wouldn't some of this just involve, too, going back to even the most basic things that we have out there? I mean, if you're in business and you want to get a good sense of where things are headed in your particular industry, why wouldn't you just look at prices?
Exactly. And the prices in just that area that actually pertain to your industry. And the one thing that's interesting is, think of the home example. If you wanted to buy a home today, the thing you need to know is the home prices in a 10-mile radius, the employment patterns, what's the local economic system that's going to support the price of that home, including your own employment reality, and is the bank going to give you a loan? You can do that now by going onto Zillow or 8 different apps that give you all the homes that were bought in the past 30 days. If you wanted to do that 10 years ago, I'm not so sure how you would get that information. You could have gone to the city hall, but it might have been a 60-day lag. So it was actually hard to get that information. It's actually really easy now. So the information that we have that we need is really easy to obtain, and the information that we think is really easy to obtain, i.e. these national numbers, are completely irrelevant to the questions that you have.
So do you advocate we get rid of them?
I don't advocate we get rid of them, 1, because they are the justification for a lot of interesting information. 2, I think if policymakers use them more wisely, and look, this is the great thing, I get to write a book and make that statement with the full awareness that the likelihood of that is minimal.
I live in Washington.
Yeah, so But if we all woke up tomorrow and wisdom and maturity, there was an outbreak of wisdom and maturity on Capitol Hill, like a really good disease, you could use things like the employment numbers to really get at where are there employment issues in the United States and why are they happening, which is very different than a national rate that acts like it's the same in Bethesda that it is in Detroit, that it is in Las Vegas.
There's also comparative value here,
so that's
too,
what
right?
statisticians say. They say, look, to have a data set over time where you can compare how things are now versus how they are then, I'm more skeptical of that because the methodology is always changing. Now, half the time we're going back and changing the data with the methodology, but I think that these sets are not as useful as we think they are. I don't think you can easily go back to 1970 and go, oh, well, we built a factory and it generated 300 jobs, because we're misunderstanding the nature of a factory today and the nature of employment today.
I mean, one of the other things that you mentioned, too, is that maybe what we need is a spectrum of kind of possibilities and probabilities rather than one definitive number. And we were talking earlier, one thing that I've noticed, I mean, the press itself seems to have begun slowly to cotton on to the fact that some of these leading indicators really don't tell us as much as they should. So I've noticed that 5 years ago, prior to the crash, they would report the monthly unemployment number.
Right.
Now when you turn on the TV, they often report the monthly unemployment number, and then they also talk about the number of people who have dropped out of the workforce and all these other kind of mitigator or other questions involved. So we do seem to be moving to some realization that these indicators don't work.
I would agree that I think there's definitely some motion there and some movement and some evolution that is inevitable and important, as are really thinking what's a better way of capturing the world we're living in rather than the recourse to this pretty limited framework. Even then, though, so we talk about the unemployment rate and whether you have a job, and we act like every job that gets created is a good job. But really, is it? I mean, if you're working 37 hours a week at $12 an hour, we should be talking about the quality of the jobs and whether or not it's allowing people to meet their means. And I'm just saying that neutrally, meaning a job is not necessarily a plus and the absence of one is not necessarily a minus. If you're 27 years old and you're unemployed in the workforce, but you're trying to create a business, that's probably a good thing. None of that we would be able to discuss constructively within our current framework. So, do you get rid of these numbers? They offer a pattern as to what's going on in the world, but a much looser one and a much less useful one. But we have massive information in a big data world at our fingertips that we can use really, really constructively if we allow ourselves to.
Numbers. That seems to be the bottom line. Thank you so much for doing this today. Appreciated it.
Thanks. If you'd asked many people in the 19th century about something called unemployment, it would have been a meaningless question, because when you had a purely agrarian world where everybody needed to work to live, literally, the idea that you could be unemployed or without work was kind of inconceivable, particularly because until the populations explodes in the late 19th century, there's almost always more things that need doing than there are bodies capable of doing it. So if you're not working, it's either because you're drunk or you have ill moral character or you're impaired somehow.
And you didn't really have a job, right?
You had work that needed doing to be fed. So it took the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the transfer of workforces from the farms into factories to create this thing called a job. I mean, look, we're painting with broad strokes here. I'm sure someone could find exceptions to these rules. And one of the things that drives the question of, like, what's the nature of work, right? Do people have a job? Are they getting paid for that job adequately relative to their needs? Is the series of progressive reforms in the late 19th century that saw this kind of industrial revolution as also a really chaotic and dislocating one in the United States. And one of the people who is drawn to basically the cause of social justice a la the late 19th century is this guy named Ethelbert Stewart, who was trained as a coffin maker in Illinois and ends up being appointed to the Illinois Commission of Labor, and then makes his way to Washington, where he joins what was then the very sleepy, not really well-funded, and only recently created Bureau of Labor Statistics. And Ethelbert Stewart, to picture him, I think of him as a little bit as if a statistician met Mark Twain. Ornery, suffered fools not at all, and was a kind of, I'm going to call a spade and find the numbers to measure it kind of guy. And he was one of these sort of driving forces of, we need a snapshot of employment, the nature of employment patterns to prevent big business from taking it out of the unions.
But he's also a man in the right time as well, too, because you have this confluence of other factors. In particular, 1920, 1921, we have this recession. It's sort of not. Zachary Karabell, you have written this fascinating book all about how we live in a world defined by economic indicators and how just a handful of them, GDP, inflation, unemployment, have come to define us as a nation, even though, as you make of the very good case, they are somewhat flawed and they are of limited value to a certain degree. How did we get to this point? I mean, start in the beginning. At the beginning of your book, you go all the way back to 1066 and William the Conqueror, and apparently our fascination with trying to measure where we stand in the world is very old.
Yeah, I mean, so let me start for one moment why I wrote a book about numbers, right? Which I'm not a statistician. I'm not even a trained academic economist. I mean, I kind of have played one in my professional career, but. So I was interested in this question of how do we get to live in a world where these numbers are so woven into our identity and they're so woven into our conversation about how we're doing as a nation, any nation, not just we as Americans. And that I was in fact trained as an historian, so the question of was this always the case? And no, it wasn't always the case, and it was in fact only the case really, really recently, given how central they were. So the question was, when did people start to want to try to figure out what was going on economically with numbers? And I do start the book with 1066 and William the Conqueror because the first major effort in the modern world, I don't know if 1066 is modern, it is if you're a classicist, was the Domesday Book that William the Conqueror commissions to survey the output of his realm. Now, you probably could have gone back to the Romans because any empire from time immemorial basically wants to know how much land is under their control, how many troops they can command, and how much farming output, because the only real source of tax revenue is agriculture. So the Domesday Book really is just an effort to count who's farming what, with the glaring exception of not including the church, because the church wasn't under the authority of the king.
And this actually previews a big theme of your book, is that even the Domesday Book had its people for a loop. You've got politicians saying, how can we even measure how bad it is when we don't know where we started from? And then, of course, you have the Great Depression. And this seems to push very much this desire to count and understand just what we're losing or how bad it is.
Yeah, so a few things in this. People like Ethelbert Stewart had been around in the late 19th century, and people like Irving Fisher, who was a Yale professor who was really interested in indices and sort of thinking about prices and what we now call inflation. So there had been some work done before the Great Depression on what's going on in this thing we now call the economy. And that too, by the way, nobody used the word the economy until the early 20th century. And the only reason why I can say that with any confidence is if you use something called Google's Ngram, which is everything printed, digitized in a Google database, and you can play around with it and find the frequency at which things were used. If you type in the words the economy into Google's Ngram, until about 1930, it flatlines. There's almost no mention of it. And then about 1930, it does this hockey stick, and where it just keeps accelerating since then. Because until we create numbers, like the unemployment rate, like GDP, like inflation, there is no the economy. There's political economy, there's the output of states, but there's nothing called the economy because there's no means to measure it and capture it. And it took the Great Depression and this massive dislocation, and we didn't know it was the Great Depression in 1929. All that people knew and all that Hoover knew was some bad things were happening that actually seemed somewhat worse than earlier bad things had been happening, because there had always been bad cycles. And Hoover had been an apostle of scientific management. That was his sort of calling card to become president, was that he was a more than competent administrator during the war. He was a minor executive, and he believed in scientific management of everything. And science demands facts. Facts, in the case of an economy, demands numbers. 1929, there were none. So he agrees with some of the movements that have been in place already to fund the Bureau of Labor Statistics to actually create an unemployment number. And that is the first time in American history or any other country's history. And it really takes until the 19th century before you start getting kind of the economic statistics that we think of now.
Now, this book is obviously hugely focused on the United States. And you make the case that again, this question of counting was ever present even in the very beginning of the United States, and very much on the mind of the founders, and in fact makes its way into the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think most people don't remember because it's not the most dramatic aspect of the Constitution. I mean, we talk about slavery, we talk about North-South and the balance of small states, weak states, minority rights, the whole Federalist Papers. We don't usually talk about that the census is embedded in the Constitution, that every 10 years there be a count of the population. And this is because if you're going to have representational democracy, you have to know how many people you're representing, and you have to decide how many representatives in the House of Representatives, which is the one part of the government that is directly keyed to population, is going to represent. But it quickly moves in the 19th century from just how many people are there and where to, the human curiosity to map and to measure. What are these people doing? What's their employment? How many hours do they spend working? What's the nature of their home life in terms of output? And so you kind of begin this creeping growth of information about people's lives economically, even though it starts with just funding who's living where and how many.
And so that gets us up to the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, where we begin to see the arrival of these modern indicators that now have come to define us so much. I think most people would be absolutely astounded. I mean, most people would be astounded by most things in this book because the history of this is all really interesting. But I think people will be really surprised to find out that the birth of a lot of these economic indicators was driven in a huge part by the kind of worries and political controversy, the cause of social justice that came along with the Industrial Revolution. Labor unions, people worrying about how much people worked and how hard they worked and how much were they keeping. And you have the great story of Ethelbert Stewart. Tell us a little bit about him.
So,
laws.
I mean, you would think it would be pretty simple to go around your realm and write down, how much corn or whatever crop was being grown. But even then, what it kind of shows is there's a big difference between counting and statistics. And there have been a lot of really good books about statistics. Statistics is the art of sampling a lot of stuff you count without having to count it all individually. But they didn't know that in 1066. They just tried to go around and count everything.
Well, you bring up a really good, and that's what I wanted you to talk about, the birth of statistics, because it is very different from counting.
Right.
And you point out there's another big leap forward in terms of attempting to count stuff when we get to the age of empires and trade, and sort of suddenly now you have like global industry, and people are even more interested in who's making what goods and where they're headed to. But there does reach this point, and tell us when that is, when people realize the difference between counting and statistics, what statistics do for you.
Right, so sometime in the sort of the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th century, people realized that one, most aspects of human reality are just too difficult to count. And the other thing is that if you go around and you count, like the first thing people realize if you try to count average lifespan, right? And particularly in a time when a lot of people didn't make it past 5, 6, 7 years old. So if you were to count all infant mortality when trying to answer the question of average lifespan, your average lifespan would be, unfortunately, extraordinarily low. So that was one of the first efforts to go, look, to really get a snapshot in numbers of what's going on, you have to actually make choices about what to leave out and how to weight things. And then there's a whole series of mathematical formulas about how to really do that artfully, which develop in the 17th century in the same soup that creates the calculus and the same German and French world of creating statistics.
Who do we credit for this?
There's Les Pierres, there's a whole number of people that if you're a statistician you kind of remember as the great minds, in the way that we look at Newton in terms of calculus and gravity, or Leibniz. But there isn't really one person who invents this. This is just a rolling series of mathematical evolutions.